Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you all here with us this morning. Would you stand? When there's a group of believers together, I can't help but sing. So we're going to sing Holy, Holy, Holy this morning. Let's sing out now. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Early in the morning our song shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down their golden crowns around the glassy sea. Cherubim and seraphim falling down before thee, which word and art and evermore shall be. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, all thy works shall praise thy name in earth and sky and sea. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. We are so glad to have you here today to enjoy this seminar, and happy to have our guest speaker with us for the day. You received a little notebook on your way in. That will take you through all three sessions if you're here for all three sessions, and we hope you are able to do so. In the back of that little booklet, just a couple of little items. There is a little form for you to fill out, name, phone number, and email. If you would be so kind to fill that out, drop it in the red box on the table back there so that we have record of your visit. And then we will also, if you would like to be added to the email list, let you know when future seminars will be coming up. We'll send you out an email reminder and invitation. We'd also like to know if you would at least, on the bottom, how did you hear about this? So we can kind of gauge our advertising and outreach and maybe some things we need to do different or what worked well for us. Would appreciate that also. Additionally, in your little bit of information is a form like this. It says, have a question, write out your question there. And we do ask that you keep it based on the topics that we have here today, and drop it in the back. And at the end of the last session, we're going to take some time, or we're going to have a final session. We'll see how the course of the day goes. We'll be consolidating these questions and then maybe seeing how Dr. Baker will respond to those questions for you at the end, towards the end of the day. Also, there is a form that looks like this in your packet, and that is concerning the next seminar that's coming up in April with Mr. Brian Lahr. You can see the subjects that will be addressed there. It'll be basically the same format as today. We'd thoroughly enjoy to have you to return for that one as well. There will also be one in October, and we'll have information coming out about that. It's already on our website if you want to see the church website about that information. So you can sign up today on this form, or you can already go to the church website and sign up for the next two that are coming up, and I'd encourage you to do so. In the front of your little notebook, you'll see the first page in, seminar schedule. That's the basic format for the day that we are endeavoring to follow, and we'll do our best, but those times are kind of a guesstimate. depending on how the course of the day goes. And you see there we'll be taking a break, approximately 10:45 to 11. We'll have a song that calls us back together to start up the next session. And then we will be serving lunch, and I'll remind you at that time we'll pray here together so that when you go downstairs, you'll be able to go right through the serving line and find a place to be seated downstairs, and we'll give you further instructions at that point today. We are so glad to have you. If you have a home church, I encourage you to be actively involved in your home church. If you do not have a home church, then we invite you to join us tomorrow. I lost track of days this week. It's been one of those weeks. Today is Saturday, right? So I would encourage you to join us Sunday morning. Dr. Baker will be our guest speaker tomorrow morning as well, and we're looking forward to that as well. I'm going to have a word of prayer, but before I do, I want to remind you to do one thing that I did also. Please silence your cell phone if you would. If you have not already, just silence your cell phone, put it on vibrate or whatever. We'd appreciate that very much. Will you bow together with me for a word of prayer? Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you and praise you for the opportunity to gather as the body of Christ from many different churches, and I thank you for that. Lord, I pray that, Lord, you would use Dr. Baker today to encourage, to uplift, to edify, to educate us. Lord, that we might be able to take a bolder stand for the gospel of Jesus Christ. For the time is short, the days are desperate, and the world needs answers that give hope. And we thank you in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Dr. Baker, if you would come this morning. We have been looking forward to this for a long time. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here with you at Calvary Baptist Church. Many of you know me, have known me for many years, but my name is Ray Baker. I grew up in Bellwood, which is not very far away from here, so Blair County is a very familiar territory to me, and I'm thankful for Calvary Baptist Church and for taking the initiative to organizing this series of seminar days in Christian Apologetics. I have the privilege of leading out today. And we're going to be looking at three main topics today: the existence of God, the reliability of the Scriptures, and the resurrection of Jesus. And then in the subsequent seminar days in April and October, the other speakers will be looking at some of the other issues surrounding creation versus evolution, the flood during the days of Noah, and applications of the Christian gospel into our situation today with identity politics and a number of other things like that will be coming in October. I'm involved in a ministry of apologetics, and apologetics might be a new term for many of you, but it's basically how we use science and philosophy and history and logic and even popular culture to both create bridges for communicating the gospel and to show why it makes good logical sense to follow Jesus Christ, why it makes good sense to believe in the existence of God, why believing the words of the Bible also are reasonable. And in Sweden, I live in Stockholm, Sweden, where I've lived for many years. I'm involved in an apologetics ministry. And my colleagues and I there are convinced that apologetics needs to be just as much a part of the ministry of every local church as music ministry, Sunday school, senior saints, and youth group, and all these other parts that we consider natural parts of the Christian church. Because if we don't make apologetics a natural part of the teaching of our church, we'll find that more and more young people, when they face the challenges that they encounter in social media, in their schools, and elsewhere, will simply leave the doors of the church and never come back. So we need to teach our young people not only what to believe, but why, and why it makes good sense to believe the things that we believe. And so that's been my ministry for many years. I do a lot of writing in the area of apologetics, mostly in Swedish, and so every time I release a book in Swedish, my family and friends say, "Oh, where can I get it?" And I say, "It's only in Swedish." And they say, "Well, when are you going to write something in English?" And so I finally caved into peer pressure about a year and a half ago and released a book in English on the theology of C.S. Lewis. I don't know if you're fans of C.S. Lewis and the Narnia books. I'm a big fan. And so this book is available. I did intend to bring a number of copies here today to sell. I had a whole box of them, but I was in Johnstown last week at Emmanuel Church, which is a pretty big church, and I sold every single copy. So I have no copies left to sell here today, but it is available through Amazon and other online booksellers. So if you're interested, if you love C.S. Lewis, if you love theology, I can recommend this book to you. All right, now let's jump into today's topic. Apologetics, as I mentioned, it's a word that may be unfamiliar to many of you because it sounds a bit like apologizing. And apologizing kind of has a negative clang for many people because it means that somebody somewhere has done something wrong. And so we don't really like to admit our weakness in that way. But really, the word apologetics comes from a Greek word, apologia, which means a defense speech. So, for example, in a court of law, if a person were accused of some sort of crime, then that person would be able to stand up and give their apologia, give their defense speech for saying why I am in the right, why you have misunderstood the situation, everything else. And so this word is actually used 18 times in the New Testament, in the Greek text of the New Testament. I want to share with you one verse which is perhaps the most famous verse where this word occurs in the Greek text. In 1 Peter chapter 3, in verse 15, it says, "But in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to answer everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." And so the words that are translated here as to give an answer, that in the Greek original text, this is the word apologia, to be able to give an answer. Now, in this verse, we see actually three relations and three attitudes. We see, first off, that there's a relationship between the believer and the Lord, that in our hearts, we're to honor Christ as Lord, to keep Christ as holy in our lives. Secondly, we see a relation to the faith, and that is always being prepared to give a defense, always being prepared to give an answer. And thirdly, we see a relation to the neighbor who asks, to answer with gentleness and respect. Now, those of you who know me know that I'm such a gentle soul, but sometimes, I encounter idiots out there. And then all of my sanctification points just go down the drain right there. And so sometimes I have not answered unbelievers gently, with gentleness and respect. Sometimes I've done it actually in a mean-spirited kind of way. And every single time, then the Lord convicts me with these words and say to do it with gentleness and respect. It's a good reminder to all of us that the point is not to win arguments. The point is to win people for Christ. Now, the Apostle Paul was actually an apologist. We see many times where he was using a strategy very similar to what we'll be talking about today in order to convince people of the truth claims of the early Christian faith. I want to show you this verse in Acts chapter 17 from verses 2 through 4. And this is during Paul's missionary journeys, and he'd come to the city of Thessaloniki, and this is, a major city in northern Greece. And it says there, as was his custom, he went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and to rise from the dead. "This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah," he said. And some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. Now notice some of these words here we want to highlight. We see here that he reasoned with them from the scriptures, he explained, he proved, he proclaimed, and he persuaded. Now these are all words that talk about some sort of intellectual activity. He wasn't trying to manipulate people with beautiful music and kind words or anything, but he was encouraging people to think, to reason, think through these things. What makes good sense? Yes, it makes good sense to believe that God exists. It makes good sense to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And we see here that when we read throughout the book of Acts and all of Paul's missionary journeys, that he made people speechless and proved that Jesus is the Messiah in Acts chapter 9, verse 22. And that he had a foundation for facts for his case, this case for Christ, that people could investigate for themselves. Like when he came to the city of Berea, and it says there that the people then examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And that really should be a watchword for every single Christ follower. Not just to accept the things that we hear, even if they're proclaimed from the pulpit of a great church like Calvary Baptist, but to examine the scriptures to see if these things are really so. Now, on occasion, I've met people who hear that I'm interested in apologetics, and they'll say something like, but yeah, sure, but didn't Paul reject apologetics in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5? And because there, in 1 Corinthians 2, it says, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. And so people say that, well, just before Paul came here to Corinth, he was in Athens. He was on Mars Hill, the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17, where he quoted various ancient Greek philosophers and writers, and was using this human knowledge in order to try and create bridges to the gospel. And the people were saying, but Paul recognized that was a poor strategy, that this was a failure. And so when he continued on his journey and came to Corinth, he said, no more human wisdom, no more, rhetoric and all this stuff, only Christ and him crucified. Well, the idea here that Paul somehow repented of the strategy that he had used in Athens on Mars Hill, this apologetic strategy that he has there when he came to Corinth, I think is refuted by several very clear facts. The first thing is that it doesn't reflect what we see in the rest of the book of Acts. Because when you go back and look at what happened in Athens, when Paul was talking to these Stoic philosophers on the Areopagus on Mars Hill, it says that there were people who came to Christ there, including Dionysius, and a prominent woman named Damaris, and a number of leading Greek intellectuals. And it says that others wanted to hear more about this. And so he opened up the door for further dialogue, for further discussion about the truth claims of Christ. And so the results that he saw in Athens were actually kind of encouraging, with some people who came to faith. And some men joined him and believed, and among them were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them, while these others said, we want to hear you more about this, in Acts 17:32. Then as he continued his missionary journeys, we see that he did not change his strategy, because the next major town that he came to was the city of Corinth. And there it says in Acts chapter 18 and verse 4 that he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and he tried to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. So reasoning and persuasion, these are intellectual activities. Then when he continued on from there to Ephesus, it says there in Acts chapter 19 that he entered the synagogue and for 3 months spoke boldly, reasoning and persuading them about the kingdom of God. Reasoning daily in the hall of Tyrannus. Okay, Tyrannus, we don't really know who he was, but probably some sort of teacher who had a school or a school of disciples that would come and listen to his lectures and everything. Tyrannus, probably not, this is probably some sort of nickname that the students gave him, because it basically means tyrant. So, I'm sure you had teachers in the past that you felt were tyrants, but yeah, this is where this guy got his nickname anyways. But Paul was using his facility, his schoolroom, basically, to engage with people intellectually, maybe even with the very students of Tyrannus, reasoning and persuading. And even, this verse here towards the beginning of 1 Corinthians where it says, I'm not coming to you with, worldly wisdom and with the wisdom of men and all these sorts of things. It doesn't really reflect, if that interpretation is correct, that Paul is rejecting apologetics and saying, I'm only going to proclaim the cross, just preaching the cross of Christ, then it doesn't match up with the rest of what we see in the book of 1 Corinthians either. Because Paul very clearly affirms some sort of argumentation, where in chapter 6, we have 6 times where Paul says, do you not know this? And so this is a kind of a logical strategy that says that here are some things that you already know, some truths that you already accept. And based on that knowledge that you already accept, it makes good sense for you to take one more step and to affirm this as well. And so he does this 6 times just in this one chapter. There are logical conclusions that we can draw from the things that we already know. And we'll be looking at that a little bit later as we talk about the existence of God. We see that Paul also affirms the use of logic and reason. And he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 15, I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. He's saying, hey, you're smart people. Think for yourselves. Does this make sense, what I'm talking about here? Use your heads. Or in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul says, for if I pray in a tongue and my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful, but what should I do? I will pray with my spirit, but I'll also pray with my understanding. I will sing with my spirit, but I will also sing with my understanding. And so he's emphasizing that the logical activity, reasoning, understanding, that these are even more important than subjective religious experiences that a person may have. And in that same context, in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, in verse 20, Paul says, brothers and sisters, stop thinking like children. You're adults now, grow up, think like adults. In regard to evil, be like infants, be just innocent, not understanding. But in your thinking, be like adults. Be adults. Now, when we talk about apologetics basically serves 2 main purposes. There's a twofold function of apologetics. Internally, apologetics strengthens the faith of people who already believe. I suppose that many of you came to Christ as children, and your family, parents may have been believers, took you to Sunday school and church from a very early age, and from an early age you started to follow Christ. And so faith perhaps has always been a natural part of your life. And that's a good thing. I praise God for people who've been raised in loving, strong Christian families. But sometimes we reach points in our lives where we begin to question all those things that I always heard in Sunday school. Is that really true? All those things that my mom and dad always told me. Is that really true? And so apologetics serves a function to strengthen the faith of the person who already believes. Because maybe you didn't, as a child, you probably didn't come to faith in Christ because you believed in some sort of intellectual reasons for why it must be true. You just believed because that's what your parents or somebody told you. And so when doubts come, and doubts inevitably will come to anyone who follows Jesus Christ, it's important for us to have those good, solid reasons that we can go back to. Something that's solid that we can build our faith on, even when our emotions may swing us in various directions. And so that first purpose of apologetics is this internal function of strengthening the faith of a person who already believes. Secondly, apologetics also has an external function, that is to persuade people who do not yet believe that the Christian faith is true. So this is really where a lot of my work comes in, as I try to engage with non-believers in Sweden many of whom consider themselves atheists and agnostics. About 48% of the population, about half the population of Sweden, call themselves atheists or agnostics. And I think about that sometimes as I'm riding the bus or the subway in Stockholm, that looking at that aisle that goes down the middle of the bus or the middle of the subway chain and thinking that every person on that side would be an atheist or an agnostic. They would consider themselves that, self-identify as an atheist or agnostic. And that by no means means that everybody on the other side is a believer. Just a tiny fraction of those people would be Christ followers. Many people would just have some sort of vague idea, well, yeah, there might be something out there I don't really know, and really I don't really care. And so that's something I think about a lot. And so many people in Sweden have never really encountered a Christian who could give good intellectual reasons for the hope they have within them. And so that's why I'm there. That's why a church like Calvary Baptist has sent me there. Now, there are many, many different topics that are covered under the kind of umbrella heading of apologetics, the scope of apologetics. We have some of these we'll be talking about today, some we'll be talking about in the next seminar in April, and others will come further on at the third seminar day in October. But we could cover the existence of God, the resurrection of Jesus, the reliability of the Bible, and these are the three topics that we'll be talking about today. We could also talk about the problem of evil and suffering. How could you believe in an omnipotent, completely good God who allows so much evil and suffering in the world? We could talk about science and faith, and this will be the focus of the next seminar day in April. Creation, evolution, that sort of thing. We could talk about ethics and a number of hot-button ethical issues that we have in our world today, everything from the sanctity of life and the meaning of marriage and sexuality and, all the rest of it. We could talk about objective truth in a relativistic world, and I know that the speaker who comes in October for the third seminar day will be focusing a bit on this sort of thing. And just on the challenge of Jesus is the only way, when there are so many other worldviews, so many other religions in our world today that are basically saying that, well, there are so many different ways to God. It's like different paths all going up the same mountain, or, that sort of illustration. So all of these things that we have on this list here are areas that are covered within the scope of Christian apologetics. But as I mentioned, we're just going to focus on three primary questions today: the existence of God, the reliability of the Scriptures, and the resurrection of Jesus. So let's get into the existence of God. Now, there are a number of different types of arguments that you could make for the existence of God. And time simply won't allow or permit us to go into detail with all of these, so we're just going to highlight two main arguments for the existence of God today. But we could talk about different forms of cosmological arguments. That is where we look at the creation of the universe and the functioning of the universe with the movement of the planets and everything else, and from there we infer the existence of God behind that. And one of the arguments that we're going to look at, the very first one here, is actually a form of the cosmological argument. Okay, I need to stop right here and say that I'm going to use some big words. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of big words. I will try to define the big words every time, the first time I use them. So do not be afraid. And if you're not used to thinking along in these categories, you know what? I am super glad that you're here today, because to me that shows that there's an openness and a desire to learn something new. I think that's wonderful. That's commendable. So even if during this first session I say things that may go over your head, do not be afraid, because it'll get easier during the second session and the third session. All right, so don't just go home after the first one thinking, I didn't understand any of that. Okay, it's just so we got to get that out of the way. Then we also have what we could call teleological arguments or design arguments. Just means that teleology means that there was some sort of purpose in mind for something. Okay, so when you say you're going to build a woodshed, or you're going to build a new deck. There's a purpose in mind for that. Okay, you want this deck because you want a place where you can sit and, sit in your lounge chair, or where you can have your picnic table and eat outside when it's nice, and, all these things. So you have a purpose in mind for building this deck. And so teleological arguments look at what was the purpose behind the creation of the universe. And so there are a lot of very good scientific arguments for the existence of God that look at the fine-tuning of the universe, how the earth, our earth, is in this Goldilocks zone where any number of thousands of parameters, if they had changed just the tiny fraction of a bit, it would make this earth uninhabitable for human life. But as it is in the design of God, it is just right for human habitation. We will also look at a moral argument for the existence of God. I have on the text there, Big Bang, maybe, I don't know. We'll get to that in a little bit, talk about that. DNA, just the information that's communicated in the DNA in every human cell points very clearly to a designer because of the irreducible complexity of the biological organisms. It's not something that simply could have evolved through the course of millions of years. And then moral arguments, so I'll be talking about that in just a little bit. Then we also have so-called ontological arguments. So now this one, this is a very abstract philosophical thing, and we're not going to get into this today, but I'll just give you a little taste of what this is about, right? Think of the highest possible, greatest being you can possibly imagine. Now think about what character qualities that being has. Now, if you could think of a being that had all of those character qualities plus something even better than that, then that is our idea of God. That's a definition of God. And so we can think of a being that maybe is loving and good and righteous and powerful and all of these various character qualities, but is not holy. Okay, so we can add holiness to our list, and so this being is also holy. We say, okay, but maybe this being is not eternal. So we could add eternity, that this being is eternal. And not just that the being happens to be eternal, but that the being must of necessity be eternal. And so you keep adding these things, and so you end up with the idea of a God who must exist eternally. Okay, like I say, for some people here, that's okay. We're not going to go into any more detail on that one. I'm just telling you that it's out there, and some people really take this line of reasoning seriously. Then there are arguments from reason. Now, this is one that I often use when I talk to people in Sweden who are interested in philosophy, because you have to have a bit of a head for philosophy to get into this, so we're not going to take a lot of detail on this, but it's basically the idea that if our brains only came about as the result of like eons and eons of biological evolution, where there was no purpose, everything is just completely random, then the actions, the electronic firings in our brain are just the result of completely random chance movements of atoms in our brain. And why should we think that that's any more valuable than the movements of atoms when I spill milk on the table? Okay, there's a lot more you can say about that, but just to kind of give you a little taste of it. Then there are various types of psychological arguments that have to do with, say, the meaning of life and what is the purpose of life. If we have just come here as a result of blind evolution and chance, then what's the meaning of it all? So you can get into some of those psychological reasons. Historical arguments related to, and I'm sure that the speaker who comes in April will be talking more about like sediment layers and things like that that we observe and how these speak to a creator, different things like that, and personal experience. is a final one. It's not perhaps so much of an argument for the existence of God, but it could provide for us a good reason for believing in God. The personal experience that I experienced, that God spoke to me, God called me to follow. Excuse me. All right, so we're going to jump into this and talk first off about what is called the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, like I say, cosmological arguments, this is a category of arguments that begin by observing the universe, observing the cosmos, right? Now, the word kalam, it's an Arabic word that just means the word, basically. The kalam argument is really very, very simple. 3 simple sentences. I think you have them there in your booklets. Easy to memorize so that you can just pull them out whenever necessary. The first premise is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The second premise is that the universe began to exist. And so the conclusion is, therefore, the universe has a cause. Done. Proven. God exists. The logic is irrefutable. The question is whether the universe began to exist. That's the point that we need to address here in seeing. We know that the argument is valid. As far as a logical argument goes, it's irrefutable. But is it also true? And it's only true if each of the premises is true. And so the first premise is pretty much, it's pretty well accepted, though, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. There's no such thing as like a spontaneous generation, something that just pops into existence all by itself for no reason or for no cause. But notice here a couple things about this. When we talk about this first premise that everything that begins to exist has a cause, sometimes people state this wrong and they say everything that exists has a cause. That's not true. Okay, that's not what we're saying, that everything that exists has a cause, because it's possible that there are things that are eternal, that an eternal thing doesn't have to have a cause. And this is exactly where atheists misunderstand the cosmological argument when I present it to people. When I talk to atheists and say, well, everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. And they say, well, who created God then? I said, well, you've missed the point here of the first premise. The first premise doesn't say that everything that exists has a cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. And according to Christian theology, God never began to exist. God is eternal, and therefore God doesn't need a cause. There's nothing that created God. All right? And I think that this first premise is really confirmed to us by our human experience, isn't it? Because, okay, if we were to walk out here after the session and find a 60-foot palm tree growing in the middle of the parking lot, we'd say, what? Where'd that thing come from? That wasn't here when we got here this morning. And we would want to know how that got there, who put that there, how did this happen? Because absolutely everything in our human experience tells us that when a thing begins to exist, there has to be a cause to it. So we have this built-in sense of causality, that we understand that there's a connection between cause and effect, and that things just don't happen like that for no reason. Okay, I'll give you another illustration here. I don't know how many of you have a dog or have had dogs or whatever. You know, dogs love to play with balls. So if your dog's just kind of lying there on the floor there in your living room or whatever, and then all of a sudden a tennis ball goes flying across the floor or across the room, what is the dog going to do? It's going to get up and run after the ball, right? Because dogs love to play with balls. But if we were in here go into the session, I'm standing up here speaking or whatever, and a tennis ball suddenly comes flying through the auditorium, what do? We look to see where it came from, right? Where did that come from? Because we know that tennis balls just don't randomly fly through the air of church services. We know that there has to be a cause. And this really is what everything of scientific inquiry presupposes, this first premise, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And that is why scientists develop hypotheses and develop experiments to try and understand what are the causes for this phenomenon that they have observed. Now, there is a possible objection. Sometimes people, atheists will say, well, is the universe itself not an exception? Could it be that the universe itself has come into existence but doesn't have a cause? Well, yeah, that is really highly unlikely for the reasons that we will see now when we look at the second premise, which says that the universe began to exist. Now, there are some philosophical reasons for our understanding and our belief that the universe has begun to exist. And that is, number one, because of the impossibility of an infinite regress of causes. Okay, we're getting some philosophical terms here, but I'm going to try and make it understandable. So I think about, I have a son who's 23 years old, and where did he come from? Well, he has two parents, my wife and me. Where did I come from? Well, I have my parents. Well, where did they come from? Well, they had their parents. Where did they come from? Well, they had their parents. And so you can keep going back, all through human history. Where did all these people come from? Well, they all had parents. So there was a cause for each new generation of humans that's born, right? But you can never have a cause which has caused this entire chain of events, which is part of the chain of events. Because if every single link in that chain is dependent on the link before it, then you can never have anything that at the very start of the chain that is also part of that chain. There has to be something outside of that chain that's the start of it. So there has to be something outside. You go back every generation of humans. As long as there have been humans, if you trace your ancestry back to Adam and Eve, or if you believe, in some sort of evolution that we've come from, lower life forms and protozoa and all the rest of it, still, at the very beginning of that chain, there has to be something outside that chain that's started that whole chain. And that's true whether you are a Christ follower or if you're an atheist. So this infinite regression is impossible, or at least insufficient as an explanation for everything that exists in the world today. I think it's that it's insufficient because if the chain of all these links that are dependent on each other even goes back in time to eternity past, this whole chain is still somehow dependent on something else and requires some sort of necessary foundation that's outside of that chain. All right, so that's kind of some philosophical reasons for that. But there are also, I think, some scientific reasons for this. One possible explanation is the Big Bang. And I don't know what you think about the Big Bang theory. For me, when I read Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was God, and God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." That sounds like a Big Bang to me. It was a big explosion, right? The difference, I think, would be between the believer and the non-believer is perhaps on when you think that took place. Now, scientists observe that all the bodies in our universe continue to move farther and farther away. Our universe is expanding. And so if you roll back the clock, you see that all of these bodies that are out there, all the planets, stars, asteroids, everything else, must have at some point been together, and some sort of energy must have been released in some sort of huge explosion they call the Big Bang, right? So I think it was God. that did that. I think that for scientific reasons, we can also accept the second premise that the universe began to exist because time and space and physical energy came into existence at some point in the past, which the non-believer around us would call the Big Bang. We also have the second law of thermodynamics with the ideas of, on the one hand, entropy, where we see that everything in our world around us goes from levels of greater organization to levels of less organization or greater chaos, becoming more chaos. And the second law of thermodynamics also entails the transfer of heat and energy from warmer objects to cooler objects. It's kind of like, if you're heating your house in the winter and it's like super cold outside like now, and you open your doors and then, it's not that the heat is, or that all the cold is going to come in the house, it's that the heat from inside the house is all going to escape out there to try and even things out, right? And so that's why it's going to get colder. It's this law of thermodynamics. And so from these two principles, both from entropy that we can observe in the world around us, how things are moving towards a greater state of chaos, just look at our political situation, and the idea of the cooling of the universe, we see that if the universe had been eternal, if the universe had never had a beginning, that at least our Earth would have cooled down a long time ago to a point where it would no longer be able to sustain any form of life. So therefore, the conclusion that we can draw from these two premises, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and that the universe had a beginning, therefore, the conclusion is the universe has a cause. Now, at this point, you might look at that and say, well, that's not the God of the Bible. And that's true. So far, we don't yet have the God of the Bible. We just have some sort of cause that set into motion everything that we see in the physical universe around us. But I think that if you start to dig a little bit more, that there are certain things that we can understand about this cause. I think, number one, we understand that this cause has to be eternal, has to be timeless, because time began at creation. There was no time before the planets began their movements. And so there had to be, whatever this cause was, has to be eternal and somehow stand outside of this flow of time. We see, secondly, that this cause has to be spaceless. In theological terms, we call this omnipresent, that is everywhere at once. And that is because of the only limitations that there could be spatially come into play after the creation of the physical universe. Before the creation of the physical universe, there were no limitations of space. So whatever this cause was has to be outside of those limitations, that is to be spaceless or omnipresent. This cause also, in the third place, has to be immaterial, has to be spiritual, if you will, because matter and energy also began at the time of the creation, at the time of the Big Bang, or when God spoke those first words, "Let there be light," that sort of thing. This cause also has to be immensely powerful. In theological terms, we call this almighty, because who else or what else could cause all of this universe to spring into existence from nothing? And this cause also has to be personal, because personality cannot rise simply out of purely material organisms. So when you start to add all those things together, that this cause that we see is eternal, omnipresent, spiritual or immaterial, almighty, and personal, we start to come close to something that looks like the Christian God, the God that created the heavens and earth. And so the conclusion that we come to here, that the universe has a cause, it's only built upon philosophical premises and accepted scientific observations that, everything that starts to exist has a cause. And so to call belief in God irrational is simply an irrational conclusion. So that's the Kalam argument for the existence of God. Let me get the schedule up here in front of me so I know how we're doing. All right, so we're going to move into the moral argument for the existence of God. Well, this is one that I use a lot in talking to non-believers in Sweden, because I find that the Swedish people have a very highly developed sense of right and wrong. You see these various lists of like the most corrupt and least corrupt countries in the world, and Sweden is always like in the top 3 or 4 as far as non-corrupt countries, which is a really good thing. And so a lot of people in Sweden have very high standards of personal morality as they themselves define it. So this is an area where I think it really does speak to the heart of a lot of Swedish people, and I hope that you'll find that the same is true in your encounters with people here in central PA. So we could summarize the moral argument like this. We could say, first, if there are objective moral values and obligations, then there is a God. The second premise is there are objective moral values and obligations, so the conclusion is, therefore, there is a God. All right, so what reasons do we have for believing that premises 1 and 2 are correct, that they are true? So we'll take the first one. If there are objective moral values and obligations, then there is a God. So why should we believe that? Well, if there is no God, then there is no ontological grounds for any objective values. Okay, that's kind of a fancy thing to say, but basically saying that where else would objective standards of morality come from if there is no God? Where else would you get an objective standard of morality? Okay, you can say, well, you know, it's just whatever our society agrees upon. We somehow, for the sake of the social contract, or so that we can get along in society, agree that we shouldn't kill each other. And so we say that murder is wrong. But this is just something that we have come up with just for the sake of convenience, to make it possible for us as a human species to survive. Say, okay, well, we say that robbery and theft are wrong. We say that because we don't want people stealing our stuff, and so we say that it's wrong for even for me to steal their stuff. It's some sort of mutual agreement we come to. We have speed limits on our highway. On I-99, speed limit's 70 miles an hour, and so we agreed to that because we know that higher rates of speed increase the risks of serious accidents and loss of life and everything like that. So we have all these various pragmatic reasons for the laws that we have in our society. But isn't there anything more foundational to that than these simple pragmatic, practical reasons? Because, okay, let's take that one with the speed limit. If we say that, if you have higher risk, if people can drive as fast as they want, whenever they want, wherever they want, then it leads to more accidents and a greater loss of life. Well, why is that a bad thing? That more people would die in traffic accidents? Well, it's because there's something valuable about a human life that we need to preserve. Okay, that's a more of an objective moral value right there, isn't it? Now, our means to that end of protecting human life, that can look different ways with, various laws that we have. But that idea that there is something special, unique about human life that's worth protecting at every cost, that's a more foundational moral value. And I think, secondly, we see that since values are about the way things ought to be, they demand a mind for their existence. There has to be some sort of mind, and I'm saying, so a person or some other supernatural being behind that, because only a divine mind, that is God, can give us objectively valid obligations of how things ought to be that are binding on all people at all times in all circumstances. And with no purpose behind the universe, life, human existence, it's hard to see how any of these values could simply be objectively morally binding. If we've just come into existence as a result of these blind forces of biological evolution, then there's no reason to think why any of these moral evaluations should have any weight to them at all. If we say it's wrong to kill, if we say that rape is wrong, why? What makes us say that? Because if it's really only about the survival of the fittest, then, those people that are stronger, they can get all these weaker people out of the way. Unless there's some sort of moral value, objective moral value to human life, to human integrity, to human dignity that goes beyond the rules that we may apply in our legislation. And also with no God in the picture, who's going to reward goodness and punish evil, then it's hard to see why any type of morality could be objectively obligatory, why it could be objectively binding on anyone. Now, see, I often push the point with people when I talk to them about this, because the explanation that you most often will hear from a non-believer is that, well, different cultures have different rules and societies and things that are, acceptable in our culture were not acceptable in the past, and the other way around, stuff like that. So it's all just purely subjective. It's an idea that they would call cultural relativism. And I say, okay, let's take something like the sexual abuse of a child. Has there ever been, in any culture, at any time in history, a time when that was morally right, when that was a morally good thing to sexually abuse a child? Yes, there have always been times when this has occurred. This has always occurred all throughout history. And there have been times when people have turned a blind eye to the sexual abuse of children. But has it ever been a good thing? No. And I intentionally pick an example like that for many people evokes very strong emotional responses, because I want them to understand the reality of what they're saying. That if cultures just simply make up their own rules and everything, then it doesn't really matter. And there's no reason why I should say that, well, your rules for not abusing children sexually, why should they apply to me? And so we come to the second premise here. There are objective morals and moral values and obligations. Why should we believe this? Well, I think that just the way that we observe the phenomenology of moral values and moral life suggests, that's just the things that we observe in our world around us, suggests that morality is objective. And this would be like where that example of sexual abuse of a child comes in. There are certain things that we just believe they are absolutely wrong, no matter what circumstances, no matter what time in history, no matter what culture, anywhere in the world, these things are wrong. And particularly, when I talk to people who may belong to a historically oppressed group in our culture, to women, people of color, people with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ community. If the person I'm talking to is a member of any one of those communities, then I'll say, was it ever right to discriminate against you as a gay person? Was it ever right to discriminate against you as a black person? Was it ever right to discriminate against you as a blind person? And here again, I'm evoking some very strong emotions many times because I want them to understand that this thing about discrimination, because I, as a member of a historically discriminated group, feel this very strongly. I know that this has always been wrong under every culture, at every time in history, all throughout the world. And so there you have an objective moral value. And without those objective moral values, there has to be a ground, there has to be a foundation for these objective moral values. It's not just, well, in my subjective personal experience as a black gay man that I don't like being discriminated against. That's not good enough. Because your lived experience is telling you that this is always wrong. This is absolutely wrong. This is an absolute moral value. And because all of our experience in life seems to indicate that there must be objective moral values, I think that the burden of proof lies on the person who denies it, on the person who says that, well, cultures just make up their own rules and they can change through time. And, in the past, people really looked down upon this or that, but now it's accepted and even celebrated and different things like that. No, that's not what we're talking about here. That's why I think that the burden of proof really does lie on the person who thinks that there is no foundation, there is no grounding for the objective moral values that we actually perceive in our own experience, in our own lives, and in our world around us. And so I think that also practically, that it's very difficult for us to think and to live and to feel as if moral values didn't exist. Sure, we may want to throw off some of the moral values and obligations that we have in our culture that are placed upon us. We may not like the moral values that God has given to us as humans. But that's a different issue, isn't it? That's an issue of the heart, and not an issue as to whether there really are absolute moral values. You may try and explain or excuse yourself and say, well, there are reasons why it was okay for me in this particular circumstance. All right? But that is just the exception is still a confirmation of the rule. Even though I may think that there are, let's just take lying as an example. Okay, we recognize that it's important to tell the truth, that lying is wrong, even though we may not think that it's a serious thing to tell a lie or to deceive someone. And so in cases like that, we may feel that it's justified for me to lie for these reasons. Okay, the Nazis are knocking on your door and want to know where all the Jewish people are that you've been hiding in your basement. Is it okay to lie? Okay, so we say, okay, well, in that case, lying is okay because it's more important to preserve human life than it is to tell the truth. We have various moral obligations, the sanctity of life, the telling of truth. And we feel that preserving the sanctity of life is more important than telling the truth. And so in this case, it's okay for us to lie. Right? But that still confirms the rule, that it is wrong to lie, that it is important to tell the truth. And that's why we come up with these reasons or excuses for what we do. So it's not getting rid of the principle when we don't live according to those principles. It's simply a confirmation of the principle. Okay, so here we've looked at two arguments for the existence of God. We've looked at the Kalam argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. 3 simple sentences, easy to learn, easy to memorize. Then we've looked at the moral argument for the existence of God. A little bit more complicated, but one which I think speaks to our experience as human beings, that we have this inbuilt sense that there are certain actions which are always wrong under every circumstance, in every culture, at every point in history. All right, we have just a few minutes until our break time, about 6 minutes here. Questions or comments at this point? There will also be a time for more questions in the afternoon, where you write your questions on the slips of paper in your notebooks. But if there was any quick question here, we could field it at this point. All right, then I'll hand it back over to the pastor. Oh, I do have one more word, though. I forgot to mention that we have a number of prayer cards available. So if you would like to get a copy of our prayer card, just talk to me during one of the breaks, and I'll make sure you get one.
All right, brother, thank you. All right, we're going to take about a 15-20-minute break according to our schedule here. I think we're shooting for about, we start the second session about 11 o'clock. So time to use the restrooms. There are restrooms, ladies' rooms on this side in the Welcome Center, men's rooms on that side. There are also restrooms on the first floor, the main floor. If you just go up these steps and angle your way around, there are also restrooms on the first floor. You can utilize those as well. All right, let's take a break and we'll endeavor to get into our next session about 11 o'clock.